topic is political economy of caste and wealth inequality and Ambedkar perspective. The discussion will especially focus on condition of marginalized communities, particularly Dalits, and highlighted some of the pressing concerns of our time. We are grateful to invite them. Just moving forward. Dontha Prashanth, sir, you may continue.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
All right. Yeah. Just a minute. I'm just checking my hotspot. Yeah, all right. It's working. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Vasnik, for extending this invitation for me to become part of this day. And in fact, it was lovely to see the conversations. I wish I had joined a bit earlier, but had I known that the conversation would be of this kind, I would have loved to join a bit more earlier because of the kind of cultural inculcation that is happening through these online meetings that are happening. So today, I would like to speak more on the aspects of political economy of caste and wealth inequality, which is drawn from an Ambedkarite perspective. I will share certain slides in the beginning to just draw some facts of understanding the contemporary reality of Indian society and how we have arrived at this state and how Ambedkar had imagined through his lens in understanding both society and economy of his context, and what were some of the solutions that Baba Saheb had offered and how they have eventually played out in certain contexts and did not play out in other contexts. So I'll just share the slides on, particularly just to highlight some facts around the wealth inequality. Once again, I'm just share. All right. I think the slides are visible. Just tell me if there's any issue in terms of the slides. All right. So just to draw some attention of the nature of wealth inequality that we have, in fact, Nitin Bharati, Chancel and Piketty have done a very good study on mapping the contemporary wealth inequality that exists in India. And in this particular study, they argue that the contemporary inequalities are worse than the British Raj, the kind of inequalities that existed during British Raj. Now, what we see, what we talk about the inequalities that have existed at the time of British Raj, we always must have heard about Zamindar, the notion of Zamindar, how this had created an unequal structure, how there were rebellions against the structure of zamindars or landlordism that was existing when agriculture was a predominant source of revenue. And back in that time itself, because land as a source of wealth had an extremely important role, one could see an extreme inequality on account of the layers of intermediation that was created as part of the political economy of the colonial rule, right? So when we map that onto contemporary time, when they comment of this extreme presence of inequalities, they also bring out these numbers, which are boggling. And if one looks into this particular graph, it is very clear that wealth inequality has skyrocketed, where this represents the share of top 1% shares, in the sense those who 1% holding national health. So it has increased from about 12% odd in the year 1962, where 1% of the population held 12% of the income or of the wealth, it has skyrocketed to 40% of wealth being controlled by 1% of population in the country. And remember, this particular data that they present is also very limited in nature because it doesn't contain offshore asset information. It doesn't also correctly map the scale of wealth in terms of land ownership, which is not revealed much. Hence, it only captures to a limited extent. Even in that limited imagination, one could see the skyrocketing of inequality that one could observe until the contemporary points. When one looks into some more finer details that they present, they argue that the India's top 1% income and wealth shares are now at the highest historical levels. More precisely, 1% control 40% of the total wealth, up from 12.5% in 1980. In fact, it's not even 1%. 0.001% owns wealth nearly 3 times that of bottom 50%. One can imagine the scale of inequality that is present in contemporary context. And when one talks about this scale of inequality, of course, one cannot but look into the status of caste and caste-based inequality, how that distributes, right? And they take an interesting data set of Forbes billionaire ranking data, in which it reveals that about 90% of the billionaire wealth in 22-23 is held by dominant castes. STs find absolutely no representations. OBCs are a little lower than 10%, and scheduled castes are a meager of 2.6%. And remember, these are also outliers within the scheduled castes who have risen up to the occasion by challenging the norms of caste. So this also is a very meager fraction as compared with the share of population that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, including OBCs, account for in India. And there's a broader data set that they also compile from the National Sample Survey, collects this data called All India Survey on Debt and Investment. So in this also, one could see very clear skewed representation of shares of wealth. For example, upper castes, who constitute about 27% of population, own about 53% of wealth. They own double to their share of population. In contrast, scheduled castes, who constitute 19.7%, own half to their share of population, which is 8.4%. That's true in the case of scheduled tribes as well. In the case of OBCs, it is a little better, but it is heavily skewed in favor of upper caste or dominant caste, that one could say. And this ties well with, because even in the accounting of the land, of the wealth shares, land holds about 69 to 70% of the assets being held in the form of wealth. Now, there's a larger picture that I've presented. And why is it that I'm presenting these trends on caste and wealth inequalities? How does it lead to an understanding of Ambedkarite political economy, or understanding inequality through the lens of Ambedkar's perspectives, right? So Dr. Ambedkar, through works from his seminal paper on caste in India, their genesis, mechanism, and development. In that itself, he develops a thesis or a treatise of caste. In that, he formulates caste as an enclosed class with different contestations of the definitions having emerged. And this enclosed class, once it is enclosed, he takes this particular definition of caste, which is defined through endogamy, which implies marrying within the same caste. He extends this argument in Annihilation of Caste, where he relates this to how caste affects economic outcomes, in the way in which there is ascending scale of reverence, descending scale of contempt. Certain occupations are placated higher, certain occupations are degraded. Now, in under such context, there is some kind of contempt that's built towards an occupational structure itself, that is guided through an already endogamized society with restricted occupations to each caste. So he extends this definition of caste, which has it at its core, endogamy as its core, and maps it onto occupational rigidity. That is, caste does not allow a choice for an individual to move out of the occupation that is assigned at the time of birth, right? And it rather locks that person in owing to the rigid conditions that are there. So hence, it becomes a source of much of the unemployment or disguised unemployment that we see in contemporary economy, because certain castes who are endowed very well with wealth, particularly in the form of land, have greater access to resources, they have mobility, and certain castes who do not have access to land are dispossessed and they are locked in that particular state of agriculture. And this is where these problems he also takes it on. So I mean, the social structure taking or superimposing itself over an economic order is explained in Annihilation of Caste. However, in the year 1918 itself, just after 1916's text on caste in India, the genesis, mechanism, and development, what Baba Saheb did was Baba Saheb had written this paper on the problems of small holdings, which anyways we'll discuss as we move forward. In that, he identifies the idea of small fragmented holdings that exist in India, and the root cause of that, so small holdings being traced back to the maladies that exist in the form of social evils. And social ills guide this present form, and the kind of disguised labor or excessive labor that's present in agriculture is also traced back to these kind of social evils that were present. And this he later develops in much more concrete detail in the work on Annihilation of Caste, right? I mean, to move forward, fast forward, we have Hindu Code Bill coming through. In Hindu Code Bill, Ambedkar, what everyone would argue is Hindu Code Bill was aimed at emancipating women by granting them equal rights over property, particularly in terms of immovable assets, right? So land was one dominant form of the same, where any kind of ancestral property, there were the rights to women were completely absent. Now, this is where, when I am talking about Ambedkarite political economy or Ambedkar's interpretation of wealth inequalities, one has to see a connect from the 1916 text till Hindu Code Bill and different texts that exist during this particular period of time, right? So when Dr. Ambedkar defines caste, caste is defined as endogamized, and or to put it in other words, it becomes an enclosed class through the channel of endogamy, and thereby in Hindu Code Bill, he also says that for any kind of inheritance of ancestral property to happen, it has to be guided by this principle of sacramental marriage. For sacramental marriage to happen, marriage within the same caste is a fundamental rule of that sacramental marriage, right? So he extensively discusses about this rule or system of inheritance of Mitakshara, which very categorically states that coparcenary rights over ancestral property or over land belongs to grandsons of the family, right? In the sense, if there is one person who had 100 acres of land, the immediate son will not have right to property in terms of selling of the land. That even if that son wants to sell, he has to consult the entire grandchildren who are men to sell this property off, right? So thereby, the rights over ancestral property are tied, are granted to the grandchildren, and particularly to the extended grandchildren, to the male heir of the family, right? Thereby, there was no rights that were granted for females. And this was absolutely absent. And again, I'll come back to this at a later point, how historical accumulation of property had denied a space for Dalits in the longer run. But just to kind of extend on this point, when one sees that Mitakshara exists in combination with this concept of sacramental marriage, right? If any of the grandchildren marries someone beyond their caste, to them, this ancestral property will not be inherited, right? And that was very well defined under Mitakshara. And I was very curious. I went back to some of the judgments that were arrived at the time of independence. In fact, at the time of independence, these judgments have very explicitly stated the rules of Mitakshara. If someone has married beyond their caste, they have denied rights over inheritance of property to them. Swayampakla Subbamma, there was one case, and there was another case in the High Court of Bombay. One can, in fact, look into these different cases as to how these rules that were there under Mitakshara were applied with, with more or less kind of a sanction that exists even under the lens of the modern jurisprudence. Right. So when we are talking about the contemporary state of inequalities, be it wealth inequalities or income inequalities, which are again rooted through the nature of occupations and whether is there an entry or is there mobility that exists at the level of society. Now, that's another question. So now these are very much critically linked with what the parents or grandparents were, what kind of position they were in, and how they had gotten an access to land. So I'll just start with a very short story of a village that I have studied as part of a field visit in Andhra Pradesh. Now, this village, very coincidentally, much before the Chowdar tank struggle, this village had a struggle for right to water, where Dalits of the village were denied to have any right over water. For them, they had to walk miles and miles to a faraway stream to fetch water, but they cannot fetch water that is just adjacent to their dwellings in the village, right? So now these rigidities in terms of disallowing Dalits from accessing to water had sharpened up tensions within the village. There was a conflict that happened, and there was resistance that was there from Dalits challenging this order, where they have reclaimed the right to have fair share of water. Now, they could get this access to water through that struggle. But however, in terms of expression of mobility, which is very expressively stated through the control of assets, the control of wealth, now that could not happen for majority of Dalits. And that's a kind of a story, and how it affects the contemporary realities that can be seen in case of Dalit youth. I'll just try to present, and then I'll come back to Ambedkarite political economy. Right. So now this village historically there were three kinds of assignment of villages. One was called government village, the other was called Shrotriyams, and the other one was Venkatagiri Zamindari. That was these are three broad villages that were there in the vicinity of the village that I had studied. Now, government villages, taxes goes directly to the government. Shrotriyams, taxes go to the Brahmins, as these were tax-free or inam lands granted to Brahmins by the state or by the Zamindar. And Venkatagiri Zamindari, taxes goes to the Zamindar. So this is essentially the division of villages was on the basis of who gets rights to taxes, right? And in this village, just observe this interesting transition that has happened. In the year of 1871, Brahmins were about 331%. Now they are 3% in the village, 3%. Velalans, which could imply Reddy, Kama, and Kapu, they were about 1,026% per persons in 1871. Now their headcount has reduced to 401%. Chettis were about 80. Their headcount has reduced to 36% now. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, in contrast to the reductions of numbers that one could see in case of Brahmins Velalans and Chettis, in the case of scheduled castes, their numbers have increased. Almost they tripled in the case of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Whereas in the case of other castes, they have come down in terms of residential stay, right? Where they are staying within the village. Residential composition has altered over periods of time. Now, what explains this pattern that exists in the village, right? For that, what becomes important is to look at land ownership. Now, land owned by Brahmins was about 615.5 acres in 1905. It got reduced to 72.3 acres. Now, remember, these are three individuals who are staying in the village, yet much of these 72.3 acres is owned by those who do not even stay in the village, right? Ownership of land held by Reddys increased from 950 acres to 1,179 acres. Right? In contrast to their decline share of population, their ownership of land has actually increased. In the case of Kammas also, the ownership of land has increased from 210 to 366. OBCs, there's an increase, but it's not in the same magnitude as one could see in case of the other castes, though it's a significant increase that one could see. Scheduled castes also improved minorly from 11 acres to 159 acres, but much of these 159 acres was, one could say, these as the erstwhile wastelands that were captured, where much of the cultivation happens as a long form cultivation, right? By planting eucalyptus trees, which will not have a yield at a very yield sooner as compared with other lands that are rotational. Every year they tend to earn the revenues, and for much of the scheduled caste, the records becomes trickier because there's also a component of assigned lands, right? So now I'll just put one snapshot of the contemporary reality of land ownership, right? So and then explain. So before I put that, so land in the case of Brahmins, what happened interestingly was when these towns were expanding. Ungol was the town of this village of Karamanchi. Brahmins, there were new positions that were created in these towns, right? As as someone who makes entries of records, or as office staff, right? As new tehsil officers have come, they will be hired as government staffs, right? So with this new emergence of towns and increased infrastructure in terms of state-led infrastructure, those who had land could migrate out from the village by selling a portion of the land to the natives, right? Now, this was one. And second thing was there were large-scale landlord anti-Brahmin movements, non-Brahmin movements that were taking out of that time, and zamindari abolition legislations have started coming in. Owing to that, Brahmins also were compelled to sell these lands away, right? So the ones who got these portions of lands initially was Reddys and later Kammas. They were the preliminary ones who got hold of these lands as residential, as they would stay in the village. So Brahmins had the first wave of migration to towns, and then to cities, and then offshore, right? In fact, they've also offshored one priest to Mauritius as well from the village. So that's the kind of offshoring that has happened. Owing to this kind of ownership of land that they had, and the way in which their consumption could be smoothened by this access to land, they could very smoothly locate themselves to an urban space, right? So that happened in the case of Brahmins initially, and post 80s, and as it came close to 90s, the other landowning castes have also started moving into the zones of privatization. First, their entry also started through effective control of schooling infrastructure and into public sector, later into private sector. Given that they had access to land, they could also leverage it on accumulating further wealth beyond the village, right? So they are part of the pharma clusters that are there. They are part of the real estate construction agencies that are there, and they've also moved into the kind of technical jobs that we see in the realm of software and medicine and engineering professions, right? So there's an interesting point that one interviewer was saying to me, which is that a sapling, which is a small, tiny plant, it will not go into a big tree without careful nurturing. That sapling has to be nurtured. You have to carefully give it water. You have to carefully look after that sapling and ensure that it grows big for it to offer shade in the long run. And similarly, children also do not grow just like that. They also need to be nurtured, mentored. And I had land. I sold about 3 acres of land and ensured that they get the best of education and ensured that they'll be sent to tuitions and coaching, and their expenses could be financed with whatever land that I have sold off. And now either both of them are working abroad, earning very well, very decent amount of salaries, right? Now, in contrast, there was another youth who's a Dalit. Now, what he says is something interesting. I'll just come to that. This. He says land plays an important role. It gives prestige. It gives economic independence. Hence, either parental or younger generation need not perform labor. For the landless households, work becomes the only mode of subsistence. Majority of others have migrated out. It takes a lot of investment on coaching, for which land is a key, as it can act as a collateral to source loans. Reservations alone are not sufficient. SCSTs are going to work because they are dependent on work. For others, it's not a problem because they have access to land. They can get loans. They have income that's earned from land, and they can even sell it under extreme conditions, right? So government school system is now losing trust. There's trust and trust, both are lost. Parents who are largely daily wage laborers do not have the scope to mentor their children because they also migrate in and out. There's education on certificate, but employment takes time, and family takes a different turn in the absence of employment. Painting, which is part of the new construction industry, does offers immediate employment in the absence of regular employment. Now, this is what is narrated by a Dalit youth who has no access to land, whose parents are landless, and who has aspirations to move out, who wants to write entrance examinations, but there's complete absence of any state level notifications, any central level notifications. Now, in that context, what should he do is to go and work as a construction laborer, as a painter in the village, in the adjacent towns, in order to earn that basic level of subsistence. Now, and when we compare the overall representation, if you're looking at this table, this is a representation index, which implies 1.4. One implies that you have more or less equal share of employment as compared with your share of population. Now look at this private formal sector, which is largely in the contemporary software, in the contemporary medicine, in the contemporary well-to-do engineering or pharmaceuticals. All of that comes under private formal. Under private formal, the other castes are overrepresented 5 times to their share of population, right? This is concerning youth of the village, right? They're overrepresented 5 times to their share of population. In case of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they are underrepresented, right? In the sense that in tune with their share of population, there's 60% gap in between the share of population and the share of representation in the private formal sector, right? So now that speaks of the kind of disparities that are there at the level of employment itself. Whereas where are they overrepresented? They are overrepresented in private formal, which is day-to-day gig kind of economy that we see, or the security guards that stand in front of a hospital, or these are, I mean, these are unsafe, unsecured jobs where there's a lot of precarity, right? Scheduled castes are largely clustered around that, and they're also clustered around non-farm labor, especially in the construction sector. Now, again, in terms of educational mapping, if one looks at them, vocational courses, which is largely ITI courses, scheduled castes have overrepresentation, and they also have overrepresentation in graduation, which is BSc, BA, BCom sorts of courses. But in technical or professional courses, they are underrepresented, right? Which is 0.7. Look at other castes. They're overrepresented even in the technical and professional graduation courses, right? So they're overrepresented 4.8 times to their share of population, right? Now, that's the magnitude of difference that one could observe at the level of a singular village. Now, what just map this back onto the nature of land inequality that is there in the village. Scheduled castes, who comprise 54.4% of the households, own only 7.9% of the land. In case of other castes, who are only 18.4% of the households of the village, they control 80% of the land. And this comes from an extensive fieldwork that was done in the village, also which is mapped with the land records of the village. Now, this is very difficult information to obtain in any kind of national representative data set, right? NSSO collects, but then information is not revealed. So it took a lot of time to get and compile this kind of information. Though it's a village, it may not be representative of the state of the country altogether, but it is indicative of the nature of inequality driving persisting, the nature of land inequality in terms of land ownership in driving the current state of outcomes that are there for more how they become overrepresented in the formal service sector, whereas Dalits are overrepresented in the informal service sector, particularly in the kind of construction jobs that we see in the contemporary Indian economy, right? So this is where the transitions that have happened, both in terms of demographic and in terms of land transitions, that have had a positive effect in terms of aspirational migration for the dominant caste on account of this access to land that they had. Whereas for Dalits, it became some form of subsistence induced migration to a large extent. It doesn't mean that there are no success stories. There are ample amount of success stories. A construction laborer does not want their children to endure the same kind of hardships of construction. One cannot imagine the kind of load that they carry on a daily basis, right? Carrying 4 to 5 piles of cement bags, or and climbing almost 5 to 10 floors. That's not an ordinary task. And they endure every kind of hardships. They do not know when an accident occurs, right? They are injured. Some of the informants have been injured on site, and they have to return back home, and they have to depend upon any kind of support that's extended by family, right? Construction in itself is heavily risk. It's a risk profession, right? So no one wants their children to become as construction laborers. However, they also are not in a position to mentor their children at the level of village, because they have to migrate. Even if they keep their children at home, there's lack of supervision and lack of nurture. Whereas this, in the context of dominant caste, operates differently. Given the kind of ownership of land that they had, they did not have an option to move out, right? Even if they moved out, they could very easily sell off property in home, or they can keep it as collateral. They can earn rents from the land. They can take loans from land and survive in the economy to which they've moved. So the younger generation does not have similar kinds of effects as Dalits or children of the landless communities have had historically, right? So that's how we also see this kind of contemporary mappings that tend to happen, right? And so this is where this ties very well to the larger question of political economy as well. Now, while disentangling this, as I've told before, Ambedkar perspective stems from these four large works of Ambedkar, and in understanding caste, the persistence of endogamy, and how historically land and wealth was caste, and then how it is inherited through this working mechanism of caste through endogamy, right? About 88% of marriages in India are still within the same caste, right? And one can imagine where these marriages are happening. In urban spaces, marriages within same caste have been much rigid than in the rural spaces or in the rural scenario, right? And thus, when one looks at such a strong persistence of endogamy, one cannot rule out caste as a driving mechanism of the nature of wealth inequalities that we see. For that to understand, we also need to just have some kind of historical realities around caste and wealth, how they've built over time. Modernity, as we look, modernity was definitely seen as a progressive. It's progressive, given that English education enables opportunities to move beyond the locus of village, against which Ambedkar had argued very strongly that villages were sinks of localism. But Ambedkar saw adopting higher education as a way to move out. And for landless communities, education becomes the lone driver of this transition, right? But modernity, at the same time, when it had arrived to India, it had taken in existing social structures into its bureaucratic forms. Thereby, even in areas where there was no persistence or presence of caste, with the expansion of colonial bureaucracy, which Aloysius very well documents, it could entrench its caste bureaucracy to other regions, and thereby these newer elites could get access to land and get control over land, because they are the record keepers and they have supports of the colonial state in the form of army support and so on and so forth. I'll just cut short in a very small note. So Francis White Ellis notes record that a Brahmin assistant to Francis Ellis describes lower caste laborers as natural slaves. And Warren Hastings commissioned Gentoo Code in 1775. William Jones felt Gentoo Code is insufficient, hence got Manusmriti translated in 1783, citing the inadequacy of Gentoo Code. Now, these were the perceptions of Orientalists that were there at the time of colonial rule. And in fact, they have considered the translation of the scriptures as fundamental, because for them, religion was important in governance of the state. To quote from the translation of Gentoo laws, well-timed toleration in matters of religion and adoption of such original institutes of the country as we do, as do not immediately clash with the laws or interests of the conquerors. The pen of the translator must be considered as entirely the passive instrument by which the laws of the singular nation are ushered into the world from those Brahmins themselves, in the sense that the kind of knowledge that the initial colonial officers were deeming was coming from the Brahmins, as whatever they were interpreting was becoming source of knowledge for the colonial interpreters as well. Now, that's where there's two kind of support that one could see. One, the caste elites have extended their support to imperialist forces in aiding the extraction of surplus, because they were appointed as zamindars, they were appointed as record keepers, and they had to ensure that taxes are paid given to the colonial regime, and in turn they would receive support from the colonial regime in the form of army. Wherever there is rebellion, it will send off its forces and quench that rebellion, and through education, with much of the initial formal education having been granted to the Brahmins at first, later to all these landed elites, right? So this nexus had strengthened the kind of wealth accumulation that they had, right? In census 1901, one could see who were these zamindars in the Bengal province. In Bengal province, Brahmins numbered the highest, about 88,000 of them were zamindars. Kayas followed them with 73,000 of them. And Bhumihars were about 36,000, Rajputs were about 25,000. And if one has the larger imagination of Bengal presidency, it had the present day Odisha, it had the present day Bihar, it had the present day Chhattisgarh, it had the present day Jharkhand. It was the largest presidency of India, right? So in that, who are these landed elites who are controlling the entire infrastructure of Zamindari system? What was this permanent settlement? And who appointed these Brahmins as Zamindars? It was colonial regime. Now, for them, the source of information was drawn from religious scriptures, right? And thus, there was this kind of inscriptional knowledge that enabled Brahmins and the dominant caste to attain this source of power, which also translated itself into control in the economic realm as well, with the kind of land ownership patterns that they have developed over the periods, right? So one can list these systems across the country, right? Be it Koddars in Maharashtra, or Jagirdars in Telangana, or even Mahalwars, which were community-based clusters, but largely controlled by Jats, or of that particular village, whatever ancestral shares of property were there. So historically, now this was the nature of land ownership. And very interestingly, when there were all these movements were happening, GB Panth was heading UP, I mean, the abolition of zamindari abolition in UP, and they come at the definition, because you have to define how much do we have to define as a ceiling and how much has to be redistributed. Very perverse form of interpretation of this definition, in the sense that they first of all believe that it should be divided on the basis of consumption, and that they distinguish that a chamar has, for a chamar, maybe 3 acres are sufficient. But for Rajput, no, that cannot be the case. The standard of living for a Rajput is much higher than the standard of living for a chamar. Hence, one is taking that as granted in the way of framing of economic holding itself, right? To which Ambedkar had a very critical intervention much before the arrival of this GB Pant report in 1948. Ambedkar had elucidated this in his text on small holdings in India, where he defines this. He smashes this concept of economic holding defined on the basis of consumption, where he says it would be perverse accounting to condemn a farm as not paying because its total output does not support the family of the farmer, though it has a pro rata return for each of its investments is the highest. In the sense, as a farmer, I have my plow. As a farmer, I have labor costs. As a farmer, I have seed cost. And if whatever output that I'm reaping is greater than whatever I'm investing, that should be treated as economic, as simple as it, as Ambedkar was arguing. It should not be defined from the point of view of consumption, whether it is supporting the conspicuous consumption that is also there, because idle labor for Ambedkar was problematic. Idle capital is not a problem, but idle labor is a problem. So what Ambedkar was envisioning throughout this text was the fundamental problem of fragmentation of small holdings that we see are emerging from are emerging from its social institution, and the nature of idle labor that is present in Indian economy is on account of extremely heavy engagement on agriculture. Hence, India needs to have a plan for industrialization, right? Which can sponge off the labor from agriculture to the new industrial clusters, which have the capacity to generate greater amounts of employment, right? So this was Ambedkar's articulation of a problem, of a resolution to the problems of small holdings that existed. Second, Ambedkar was critical of capitalist form of agriculture, because at that stage, when one could see that India had heavy dependence of agricultural laborers, right? If you have capitalistic farms, that will drive them out of agriculture, that will devastate their lives, bring their lives into much more problematic state. Hence, he was critical of even capitalist farming, which is large consolidated plot operating as capitalist farm, right? That also he was critical of. For him, industrialization was a way forward. Second, he was in favor of state-led collectivization of farms, but that since did not happen, he did not pin his greater hopes on the state-led farms, right? But industrialization did remain as one of the key argument that Baba Sahib had articulated. Now, in all of this, once we see after arrival of independence, what one could see was you did had a scope for industrialization. But however, if one looks at Baba Sahib's thinking on the existence of cooperation, cooperation cannot be achieved through caste. Caste, it fragments, where one's interest is towards one's own caste. It does not extend beyond one's own caste, right? Cooperation, it also limits itself to one's own caste. Now, when this was Ambedkar's views, and what happened in the post-independence, independent India's policy evolution, was the idea of cooperative farming was something that was romanticized more than considering eliminating the social evils that were present. Now, that could only be possible by enabling land to the tiller, right? Land to the tiller, no matter how much small of a holding, can be enabled to landless cultivators. Along with this project on industrialization, that could have resulted in a much more equalized trajectory along with growth in the economy. But what happened of late was there was this heavy emphasis on cooperatives. Now, how did these cooperatives fare out? Was you had cooperatives in the form of primary agricultural cooperative societies, you had cooperatives in the form of primary, in the form of credit societies, and these cooperatives were functioning at the level of mandal or village units who were controlling these cooperatives. There was complete elite capture of these cooperatives. Thus, whatever state was investing through this idea of cooperatives, they were largely grabbed by the elites. Again, when Green Revolution kicked off, the ones who could mechanize first were these dominant castes, and the ones who could gain have had one had larger gains from this project of green revolution across the country in all the riverine delta belt zones where the dominant caste, because of their initial access that they had to credit machinery and to technology and so on and so forth, right? So this Francine or Frankel has, I mean, very elaborately explains on these outcomes. I'm not going to spend much time, right? So when one understands from then on to the liberalization episode, the kind of capital that was there. Now, capital, if one cannot see any kind of change happening at the level of these social structures, capital also becomes fragmented. And capital also will be governed through the same rules of Mitakshara, where co-parcenary rights exist, capital becomes caste capital, right? So thus one could see this larger connect that one observes in the case of the present mapping that we are observing I mean, in the way in which the kind of inequalities that exist in wealth distribution, they align very well with the structure of caste. Now, with this, I will not extend much, but I'll be happy to take some questions, and then probably from there we will proceed on further clarifications and comments. I've cut short a much larger, longer story, given the paucity of time, into a small snapshot sort of a thing. But in interaction, I'll be happy to clarify more. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prashant sir, If you have any questions, raise your hand. Otherwise, type in the chat box.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Devin Prashanth sir, thank you. Thank for the insights. First of all, it was very informative. When you see the number, it gives the more idea the severity of the issue and all. Like, so it look more meaningful when we are discussing. So just a question here, like, what will be the best idea, like a better treatment to solve this type of issue, like the land distribution, or of course, the education system going more in private hand. So how the distribution should be happen, and what government should take that steps, like what type of step will help to solve this issue of the land distribution so that SC/ST community can grow faster.
Well, I mean, there was a very interesting intervention that happened in Telangana, thanks to CDS, Center for Dalit Studies, and Telangana government back then. It had intervened through this scheme called land purchase and land distribution to Dalits, where they will purchase land from the dominant caste and they will allot not 1 acre but 3 acres of land to Dalits, and with fitted borewell, uh, of whom the cost will be borne by the state. Right now, that's a very good intervention. Though, of course, in a village, maybe two beneficiaries might have gotten access to that kind of land, but that will have a longer impact on the life cycle of that family which has acquired this particular scheme. Because otherwise, earlier what had happened was much of the distribution that got phased out was the uncultivable pastures, which were redistributed in the form of Bhudan movement, or which was taken over as control by the state. These were given to the landless Dalits. Now, if these uncultivable lands were given to landless Dalits, what kind of investments can they make? First of all, they cannot obtain any loans on these lands. Much of the assigned lands, even today, do not have any loanability in banks, one. And two, even state schemes also do not get applied to these assigned lands because they cannot be sold, right? Assigned lands are of that nature, where they can be transferred within the community, but they cannot be sold beyond. And much of the rights are still state come individual, both are combined in the case of assigned lands. So that becomes a tricky question. But this scheme did have some kind of positive ripples, but this will also be limited given the extent of how much state will be willing to invest in purchasing and redistributing. Baba Sahib was against this idea of purchasing because that's impossible. That's impossible given the limited resources that state has. Hence, for him, state-led collectivization, where entire land of the country will become a national asset, right? And through that, you can divide them into parcels, you can make them into economic holdings, and then give rights over use of land to individuals for better productive engagements, right? So thereby I mean, they're also becoming formal employers. They'll receive a portion of profits by paying taxes. I mean, this kind of collectivization did happen in China with state-led collective farms, with state having definitive rights over land. But India, that did not take over because much of the vision was around cooperative farms. Beyond this, for Dalits, that's where education has become one of the fundamental mover of social mobility. And especially when government jobs exist. But now there is completely, there's complete reduction of the portfolio of jobs that exist in the government sector. So in the present context, the contemporary reality is a bit gloomy. And that's where one could see rising share of workers moving into construction and other forms of informal sources of employment. Now, this is a trickier question to answer as well, but there has to be some kind of collective reimagination that needs to be imagined. For example, Nalanda kind of initiative. That's a brilliant initiative which is taken up by Anup Kumar, or bureaucrats taking up these charges on their own in developing the school infrastructure. You have infrastructure which is huge asset. None of the private institutions can compete with this infrastructure. But is there a committed second generation Dalit officer who would be looking at the concerns of the first generation Dalit youth of the present time? Now that's the contradiction that we need to reimagine as a community. If we were to think through state, then state must have to abide by its responsibility of redistributing resources, because these are not on account of someone not putting their efforts, but these are snatched from them historically, right? Through Patel Patwari systems or Kulkarni systems, or through repayment of loans, and all of these were there. Hence, state has its responsibility and duty to ensure that these resources are reallocated. State has large land banks, but state doesn't want to allocate it to Dalits. Rather, they want to allocate it at a throwaway price to their own caste conglomerates, right? 1 rupee per acre land, or 0.25 paise per acre land, even in today's context, right? That's how one could see how Hyderabad real estate got expanded at throwaway prices to their own caste clusters, right? That's how much of the real estate expansion is also happening through this. So if state can do this, to their own caste brethren, but why can't it do for Dalits as well at the same scale? Now, this is a question that needs to be problematized at a deeper level. But more collective action from the community would have positive gains, because community also has a cream that exists now, that if it can looks back to the society, that can actually accentuate gains for the community in the long run. But this is limited again. This is limited. Yeah. Subhash.
Yeah,
Did
thank you
I
for
answer?
Prashant for answering that question. And yeah, I just summarize this like this is like a teamwork, like government, NGOs, people need to come together to solve this issue. It will be not like 1 day or 1 year or 10 year time span will solve this problem, but everyone need to be honest, hard work to solve this issue. Like government need to come with the proper policies. A lot of NGOs or people a similar mindset need to come and share the information, make the people aware about it. So then only this issue will be get resolved. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. It is really very insightful. So thanks for sharing, and would like to hear again from you. I know that because of time constraint, we may cut down your presentation, but would like to see you again. I will not take more time. Maybe I saw a couple of other hands which raised, so I will allow other people to ask question. Thank you. Thank you, Prashant sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Prashant sir. Thank you, everyone.
I think Pawan raised his hand. I think Pawan part. Okay. But I think I don't see
No,
anyone.
I had this.
Oh, there is one, Sam. I'm just looking at the comments box. I heard that you were closely associated with Rohit Vemla as his roommate and were actively involved with ASA during that period at HCU. Could you please share your perspective on how these events unfolded internally, the struggles students faced, and how a movement later became a national-wide voice for social justice? And how do you see the long-term impact of that movement today, especially regarding discussions around Rohit Vemla Act and caste discriminations in universities? All right. I think, this might take another session to answer that question, but I will very succinctly discuss about this. Now, which is again, so when we look at Ambedkar Students Association at University of Hyderabad, and the way in which it was established in the year 1993, and when it was established to have a separate course of action around Ambedkarite discourse as compared with the radical left imaginations that were present back in that time. And
No,
Vivek
go ahead.
raised hand.
Yeah, go ahead. You answer this question, what you're talking,
All
and
right.
then I will ask you.
It was imagining through that, and then self-respect and dignity were at the fundamental core of building of organization, and leading Ambedkarite struggles was a fundamental core, because uh, what we have learned from our seniors was you have to read very well before you go and speak to administration, before you represent anything to any official. And that's what we were told, and that's an inherited knowledge that we gained from our seniors of ASA. And we also had a worst episode in the year 2002 in the form of rustication, where 10 Dalit research scholars and students were rusticated for standing up for their self-respect. But none of them have gone and apologized, have bent themselves down before the casteist actions that were initiated by one professor who became vice chancellor later on, Apparao, and whose role was instrumental in the institutional murder of Rohit Vemula. So, but then they did not bend down. They stood to their ground. They came back and they have worked on their PhD. They have submitted. Most of them are teaching at premier educational institutions of the country, and they have also went to premier educational institutions to pursue their postdoc as well. So, I mean, that was one moment of how self-respect and dignity can transform one's life. For me also, when I entered into university, I had no imagination of understanding of caste. I know that I am a Dalit, but I do not know how to comprehend myself. I would often side with others in my journey because of the alienation that I experienced. But ASA used to organize workshops, used to organize talks and sensitization, cultural activities that shaped our imagination in a very different manner. So in 2016, I will not go much into the details, but when someone wrote ASA goons are talking about hooliganism, now goon is a word that is often very easily attached to Dalits, and that's casteist slur that's used. And against that, in the presence of duty security officer, in the presence of the university authorities, when that person gave an apology, just because that person's party is in the power, they've used all kinds of mechanisms against five of us, and suspended initially, to which we have resisted because it goes against every grain of evidence that was there. Duty security officer gives a statement that allegations made by this ABP person were not true. Doctors testify that allegations were not true. And just because there are letters shooted from the ministries or union ministries, there was action taken against us. It cannot be done. So first Vice Chancellor revokes it with an afresh inquiry clause. Then 5 letters were shot from the Ministry of HRD that led to another round of social boycott, with Rohit writing a letter to VC on the same day of social boycott, saying that for having self-respect, 5 Dalit scholars were socially boycotted. And just because we were reading Ambedkar, you could have given us a rope at the time of admission, so that whenever we feel like reading Ambedkar, we can. I mean, I don't want to share this, but then, yeah, this is distorting. And then we move to High Court. High Court also does not act quickly. It posts it after a month. Then, despite the petition being there in the High Court, the university locks all of our rooms. That's when that's where the picture of Rohit carrying the portrait of Baba Saheb, me carrying beds and moving out of hostels, coming out in the open, staying out in the open space with our friends, bringing the portraits of our leaders, making them as a temporary arrangement to both of us, comes as a shelter. And as courses, as things have moved past, since administration was also hell-bent, since there was complete absence of humanity, and all of that was reflective through what Rohit wrote at the end, just before his last moment of physical life, that the value of a man has been reduced to his immediate identity, nearest possibility to a vote, to a number, to a thing. And if one were to read that note, it comprises everything right from his childhood till the date of his physical departure in the university. And this is an institution that also fails to learn from its past. Its past also had many institutional murders with its own committees pointing out to lapses of the university. Interestingly, the MHRD had appointed one two-member panel that also had pointed out at the lapses of the university, but they had reversed that and appointed one-man member committee to change the entire narrative. And the cases are still going on, and we are fighting the battle for justice. In this process, we also are fighting for Rohit Act, because when this happened, we have SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, but we don't have an act to curb discrimination that happens in the universities. Till a point of time when dominant castes existed in the villages in order to exercise their dominance, they had committed heinous crimes against Dalits who stood for their self-respect. Now, when Dalits started entering education institutions, entering urban spaces, when Dalits started exercising our own self-respect and dignity, standing up for ourselves on the path of Baba Saheb, atrocities have increased in different forms. So, in that light, the first immediately after Rohit's institutional murder, it also came as a demand for enacting Rohit Act to curb discrimination that happens in higher education institutions. Right now, in Karnataka, the draft has been accepted by the cabinet. There was, Priyank Kharge was instrumental in taking the efforts. There's a civil society that is active. Of course, these efforts were taken up by Ambedkar Students Association at University of Hyderabad, later on by Ambedkar Reading Circle in Bangalore, which was supported by many more civil society groups, because Bangalore also has Dalit organizations and progressive organizations coming together, which formed into this campaign for Rohit Act, which led to the stage of cabinet approving the passage of act, but it has to go to the assembly. We have to wait and see how it takes course and how this can be replicated across the country, because the acts of discriminations are not stopping. Just recently, again at University of Hyderabad, one student was insulted, abused by caste, and was assaulted, and that student had pursued for justice. It usually UGC regulations mandate for 60 days. But for this student, it took 134 days, even for getting an apology note, which he hasn't gotten yet. But because there are these autonomous organizations that exist in this campus, which fights for justice, there's some way in which administration also keeps accountability. But imagine IITs, IIMs, all these premier institutions, which do not even have any autonomous formations, what kind of alienation, what kind of discrimination the students from marginalized communities must be suffering, must be going through, what kind of loss of self that one would go through, right? So in this context, it becomes imperative for an anti-discrimination legislation to come up across the country, across education institutions, and by not acknowledging, so caste discrimination exists, but it's not discussed often, right? And if it is discussed by Dalits, but not by the other, right? It has to be acknowledged as a reality, and actions have to be initiated. Now, otherwise, tensions will flare up. Society will not stay at a stagnant mode, and that's not good for any kind of society, right? That's where Baba Saheb was also very concerned about persistence of inequality in the society, which will shake the very foundations of democracy. The longer the inequality persists, the danger is it for the democracy, right? So hence it becomes part of the duty of the state also to consider these demands and ensure that appropriate institutional controls are placed. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered enough. I think this.
Okay, so I may ask
social
you.
justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dontha, and I think it's wonderful session and a lot of input that you are giving and answering the questions. That's really highlighting, the persistence in your voices as well. That you continued going on the line of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Has he fought for, and this word still matters even today because we still see the inequities in our society. Even though we are in this modern era, people are reaching to the moons and whatnot. Eight, the caste has not left this soil, and with that saying, with our communities becoming more educated, bringing this, raising these voices, of inequities in our societies, bringing to the mainstream medias. Eight, we see time and again, the mainstream media doesn't take the note of it, right? And I think they are completely being ignorant or intentional ignorance, we can say. And on the line of your topic, where you talk about the land inequities in our society, I see that in Maharashtra, I believe there may be even the ceiling laws even to still exist today. I don't know how much impact has made to offer these lands by the government to our community, and based on the data that you're showing, it has not made that much dent. It doesn't show that, it doesn't reflect the equal distribution where people would be noticeably landowners even today, right? I don't know how it is in the other state, like particularly the state you belong to. Going with that same understanding, bringing all this data forward, okay, raising these issues time and again from ever since our community is becoming more aware and alert about it, and raising the voices of the land distribution to the SC and STs. What is it? What will it take? The government to understand. Putting all this data, is government completely blind, citing these issues, not paying the attention of the inequities in land distribution? And based on your research that you are putting it forward, what is the take, the government is taking out of it? That's
Yeah,
my
I mean,
question.
so government is not blind. The government for sure knows, because and then the ones who rule the government unfortunately come from these landed elite castes. So they don't want to disrupt their zones of power, and that has been the case throughout. I mean, if one were to have the phase of Indira Gandhi did want to implement serious course of land reforms. Now, for one reason, that there were radical movements that were emerging during that point of time, immediately after the Green Revolution. And till 1972, there was no ceiling limit that was proposed because none of the states were the state leadership, which is composed of the landed elites, that was against this idea of land reforms. Even, in fact, the entire Keshwananda Bharati case was filed against the Kerala government on this principle of taking off the trust land for redistributive agenda, right? And in which land was defined as right to property, and that's where Indira Gandhi's Tasavvur Supreme Court also goes through, right? So whenever a serious course of reform process was to be taken off, the landed interests were very conscious of what is at stake for them in terms of dominance. So, but then in terms of the other, the only option is either through democratic exercise of consolidating votes or through violent struggles, right? You go, you reclaim the land. But the second one has its limitations in its framework itself, because we are seeing what is happening across the country in present context, and who are the ones who are most affected in these kinds of violent incidents that are happening, right? So where state has enormous power against no matter what kind of radical forces that one could see, right? But then alternatively, there has to be some sense of democratic consolidation that should also take place in highlighting the issues, in taking these issues to the community. And this need not result in a positive action that let's still take a step ahead, but at least it informs us about, all right, why are we at this state? it at least lets me know of my history and why my position is like this in this context. Otherwise, I may blame myself too much in this, I mean, in the context of the kind of alienation that emerges on account of caste in the society. So, I mean, in that sense, both on sociological, as sociological reasoning and as a course of action, both are imperative. So once state has massive land banks, it is not that state doesn't have. For example, in Maharashtra, Vatan lands, they were supposed to be given, they were supposed to have gone to Dalits. In the case of Tamil Nadu, Porumbok lands, as a matter of right, should go to the Dalits. But then state is not enabling that full control over lands. Instead, it is interested in creating parks that can be allotted. It is interested in giving these lands to their own network of caste conglomerates. So this is where it has to be highlighted and it has to be discussed. And it should be discussed with the people. So that's, I mean, it does exist in academia, but it should go back to the masses is what is needed. One and two is it's important to discuss about the histories of inequalities just for the present generation to understand why we exist at this state. And three, I just want to appreciate the initiative that you all have taken in the cultural inculcation of self for the younger generation. I think this comes as a unique experiment from Maharashtra. I hope if this is replicated elsewhere, there is no problem of alienation of self, right? There is so I mean that doesn't happen. One does not become subsumed under the structure of caste, under whatever. So whenever there is some kind of violent mobilization that happens, one does not run through it. Rather, Ambedkar's path becomes much clearer. So that's where I was very, I missed out the first part of it. I regret it, but that's extremely good. Alienation aspects to the children itself. They can stand up in the future for themselves and for the community. Yeah. On these land issues, Manish.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dontha Prashanth. Really appreciate and very new insights that we haven't looked earlier. I know we are running a little late over time than we allocated. So I believe we will take one last question. And like Manish mentioned on the chat, we would really like to have you again, because when you're representing facts, no one can deny that. And that's the beauty of academicians and PhD holders and elites from the community who can represent the community in much better way that no one can deny on. So really appreciate, I really wish we could continue this, but considering the time, we will take one final question. And I see Dr. Obaid's hand is raised. So let's take one question from him, and then we would like to conclude it. Thank you. Go ahead, Obaid.
Yeah, thank you. Dontha Bhai, yeah, I had a question, but I think you already answered it. Just when you shared the Rohit Vemula movement memories and all that, I just recalled my memories with you in Delhi, and we marched from to Jantar Mantar with Bala Saheb and all the left, and yeah. So it was refreshing, and it was so good to see you after I think 2017. I'm seeing you. So yeah. Just last few words, I just would say like, आना अपने घर की संस्था है. You're always welcome. And so yeah, we it was so good to hear you. So would like to have more dialogues with you. And yes, I will get in touch with the ANA members, and would like to have another special session with you. And we'll continue this conversation. And of course, I'm personally in the opinion, I want you to be in the parliament, right? Yeah, you need to be you are needed in the parliament. The voices like you. So hopefully in the near future. So yeah, Jai Bhim to you, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jai Bhim.
Obaid bhai, you want to go ahead with your question?
No, I'm done. We're good. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. We can take one final question if anyone has. Kindly raise your hand. And if there are no questions, Prerna, would you like to conclude?
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, sir. Now you can take down your screen.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, your screen is still shared. Hello. Okay, done. Thank you. With this, we come to the conclusion of today's online Buddha Vihara session. I would like to sincerely thank respected Bhanteji, Dr. Prashant sir, and the session coordinator Kranti ma'am, and to the all participants who are joining us today. Your presence and participation made today's session meaningful and successful. Thank you everyone for your valuable time. Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya.
Thank you, Jai Bhim, everyone. Thanks, Prerna.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on board, Jabin. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Jai Bhim.